In Healdsburg, a small, quiet town, life flowed like the smooth rhythm of a summer's day, but behind that outer calmness lurked a secret turmoil. For 20-year-old Mary, everything in her world seemed to remain the same, but something underlying was beginning to change. Her father, Tom, was a reserved, taciturn man, his presence always felt but seemingly distant. Her mother, Tina, loving but often tired of her work and worries, seemed to dissolve into the hustle and bustle of her daily duties. They lived near each other, but not together. One of those languid summer evenings, when the warm breeze lazily swayed the curtains, Tina fell asleep on the sofa, and Mary was alone with her father. There was a heavy silence in the house, filled only by the quiet ticking of the wall clock. At that moment Mary felt something strange, as if the familiar calm had suddenly shifted. Tom, as if sensing the same thing, suddenly spoke. His voice was deep and slightly hoarse, as if he had been saving up something unspoken for a long time. "Have you ever wondered what it means to be truly close to someone?" His words pierced the silence like a blade. Mary was surprised and glanced warily at her father. He rarely spoke of such things, and there was something new and unfamiliar in his gaze. "I think so," she answered, not hiding her confusion. "Why do you ask?" They talked for a long time, discussing books, childhood memories, even laughing at family anecdotes. But every moment of this conversation was strangely tense, as if there was something much more behind the words. Mary felt it like an electric shock in the air, pausing involuntarily between lines. With every minute of their conversation it seemed as if they were opening up long-forgotten corners of their souls to each other. But at the same time Mary began to feel some inner heaviness. It was as if the boundary that had always separated them as father and daughter was beginning to thin. As the clock struck midnight, Mary glanced up, trying to regain her sense of reality. "I should probably go to bed," she squeezed out, getting up from the couch. Tom gave her a long look, as if he wanted to say something else, but he held back. Mary felt the tension in her body and hurried to her room without looking back. She couldn't sleep for a long time that night, tormented by a vague feeling that something irreversible had happened to their relationship. "Good night, Mary," Tom said softly, his voice flowing like a river hidden under ice. "You too, Dad," she said as she left the room, feeling his gaze on her. Mary couldn't understand what it was about this goodbye that bothered her. It was more than a simple conversation, something that mixed warmth with anxiety, making her heart beat faster. That night seemed to leave a mark on her soul forever. With each new day, thoughts of what had happened played over and over in her mind like an old tape that would never end. In the weeks that followed, Mary found herself alone with her father more and more often. Tina was always busy with work and was less and less at home. Between Mary and Tom, their conversations took on a new meaning, filled with a depth of emotion that delighted her but frightened her at the same time. Something invisible seemed to connect them, but kept them from severing the last thread of sanity. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sky darkened, Mary suddenly turned to her father without raising her eyes. "Do you think people can change?" Tom sighed, heavy and deep, as if his lungs had suddenly refused to cooperate with him. "I think they can," he finally answered, "but it takes effort. Sometimes we get so stuck in ourselves that we can't see a way out. Do you ever feel like you've reached a dead end?" Mary felt a sharp jolt in her chest, as if his words had directly touched her own thoughts. She turned her head and stared intently into her father's face. His eyes were empty, as if hiding something deep inside that he was afraid to show the world. "It happens," she said quietly. "What about you? Would you like to change something about yourself?" Tom held his breath, and a shadow of pain flickered in his gaze. Sometimes, his voice was hoarse, like he was barely holding back something more. "But to change is to face the parts of yourself you've always run from." He was silent, his face impenetrable, but Mary could feel the unspoken feelings raging inside him. Her heart clenched with pity and a strange need to protect him at the same time. But she realized, something about this moment was wrong. She couldn't explain to herself what it was, but the line separating them was growing thinner and thinner. As summer approached, those feelings grew brighter and brighter, like a fire fanned by the wind. Each new conversation with her father blurred the line between them, and it both fascinated and frightened her. Mary couldn't be sure whether she wanted to be near him or run away. But there was a growing unease inside her as she realized that this connection was beyond what could be considered normal. One rainy afternoon, when Tina had gone to the store, Mary found herself alone with Tom again. The rain pounded on the windows, drops falling on the glass, blurring the landscape outside the house. Everything seemed as familiar as ever, but something in the air had changed, as if the rain had brought with it a new wave of tension. Mary sat across from her father, tapping her fingers nervously on the arm of the chair. Her heart was pounding frantically as she suddenly asked the question that had been bugging her. "Dad, do you ever feel trapped?" Tom raised his eyes to her. They were full of fatigue, like a man who has carried a heavy burden on his shoulders for too long. "What trap?" he asked, his voice barely audible, as if he didn't want to be heard. "In life. In relationships. Sometimes I think there are things we can't say. Things we're not allowed to feel." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst with lightning. Mary saw Tom's face become serious, even a little hard. "It's natural to want something more," he finally answered, "but it can lead to complications, especially in a family." His words cut her heart. Mary felt her breathing become heavy, as if an unknown force had constricted her chest. At that moment, the sound of the key turning in the lock broke the rising tension. Tina returned home, unaware that she had interrupted something important. Mary averted her eyes disappointedly, feeling the moment had slipped away. Even so, the bond between her and Tom was only growing stronger. Autumn was on its way when Mary realized that she could no longer ignore what was happening. Her feelings for her father were becoming more and more confused, and it wasn't just a daughter's love for her father. There was a strange, restless attraction growing in her that made her question her every move. She tried to suppress the feeling, convincing herself that it was just a mind game, but it was getting harder every day. Tom had changed, too. He was no longer the aloof man she'd known. His attentions became more intense, his gazes longer and filled with a hidden meaning she was afraid to understand. Mary woke up in the early morning when the sun was just beginning to cast its golden light across the room. In that instant she realized that she could no longer go on with this life of deceiving herself and everyone around her. Every morning, every evening in the house with Tom and her mother had become unbearable for her. She felt her heart torn apart every time she saw his gaze full of unexpressed emotion, and when Tina, her mother, lovingly embraced her husband, unaware of the passion that lurked beneath the surface of their family. Gathering her strength, Mary decided she had to escape. Living under the same roof as Tom was no longer an option. She felt that her life no longer belonged to her, she had become a hostage to her own feelings and fears. Mary quickly packed her things, leaving nothing in the house to remind her of her former existence. Without saying goodbye, without leaving a note, she disappeared. Her decision seemed to her the only right one. Her mother, not knowing what was happening, called her every day, tearfully begging her to return. Her voice was filled with despair and pain. Mary felt guilt building in her soul for this unexpected escape, but she couldn't and wouldn't go back. Every word her mother said hurt her, but telling the truth seemed impossible. How could she explain that her leaving had to do with Tom, her father? That truth would destroy her mother, erase her love for her husband, destroy the family. Mary was afraid of causing more pain. Tom wasn't silent either. He tried to contact her several times, sending messages, offering to meet and talk to her. He wrote that he wanted to mend the relationship, that they could discuss everything calmly. Mary knew, however, that this meeting would only make things worse. They were both trapped in their feelings, and any new contact would only make things worse, reopening the wounds she had worked so hard to heal. Years passed. Mary tried to put the past behind her, gradually severing the thread that bound her to Tom. She found solace in the company of friends, surrounding herself with people she felt at ease with. During this time, she met a guy her own age, someone who didn't carry a heavy load of secret emotions and painful memories. Her new attitude toward life became brighter. The ordinary, simple relationship with this young man was a breath of fresh air for her. She now looked at her life from a different perspective. Years later, she finally realized how damaging her relationship with Tom could have been. She began to see that their closeness, what had once seemed like a deep spiritual kinship, could ruin the lives of many. Mary was afraid to even imagine what would happen if the truth came out. How would her mother react? How would they all be able to move on with their lives if the secrets came out? Now that Mary was living on her own and realizing that those feelings were just a painful mirage, she was learning to let go of the past. Memories of what had happened with Tom had become something of a bad dream that was beginning to blur in her mind after all. The years had helped her distance herself from those events, and with each passing day she could feel it all drifting away, leaving room for a new, healthy life. Still, sometimes at night, Mary would be suddenly awakened by vivid dreams in which Tom would reappear. In these dreams, he would look at her just as he had in those unforgettable moments, and her heart would clench at the memories. But even then, waking up in a cold sweat, she forced herself to remember that it was all the past. Those feelings no longer had power over her. Mary knew she could never go back to who she was before all of this. The experience had changed her forever, made her more cautious and thoughtful. Now she chose the simple pleasures of life, enjoyed friendships, honest relationships where there was no room for lies and pretense. Every now and then, however, the thought of what was left behind the scenes of this story crossed her mind. How did Tom feel now? Did he continue to hide his true emotions? How was his life developing? Mary didn't dare think about it for too long. This reminder was causing her the pain she had long tried to get rid of. She was no longer the young girl who ran from feelings she couldn't control. She was stronger, more mature, and had learned to forgive both herself and others. Still, deep down she knew, there were some things that could not be erased. The story with Tom would always remain a part of her, even if she no longer allowed those memories to rule her life.